So this week, we're going to kind of go through a point that was brought up last week by chance, not by accident, but by chance. Um, and his point was asking about what the Bible said about head coverings for men. And we'll get into that. And so that's our topic today. I've taught on this before, and it hasn't always gone well. The first time it went very badly. Many of the women in the church actually despise Paul for what he says. They don't like him telling them how to dress. They don't like him telling them how to wear their hair. And they generally consider him a women hater because of the different things that he teaches. And that's something I've seen before in the church. They won't say that they hate Paul. They'll say that they don't like what you're teaching, what I'm teaching, or whatever somebody else is teaching. So that they won't actually say that they don't like Paul. But and because of this, when the women in the church are unhappy, the men often act to try and make them happy, and they've found ways to twist Paul's words to make it possible to ignore them or do something else with them. And that was the case when I first taught this. And so the next picture I'm going to show you on the next slide. When I first presented this, I'm pretty sure it caused a bunch of the women in the church to become so angry that they stopped listening and they never heard the rest of the presentation at all. They were just fuming about what the picture was and what they thought that I was trying to teach from it. And so they were quite unhappy about that, and they got the pastor to later on to go and teach it correctly. And we'll talk about what the correct interpretation is for women. And so that's the terrible picture. These are Mennonite women, and they cover their hair. And the Mennonites aren't the only ones who do that. That's a common thing in a lot of different groups. And they require that of the women. But they don't understand what Paul is saying here in Corinthians. And it is difficult to understand. Paul does a whole bunch of things that make it difficult to understand, to be honest. So that's what I'm going to be taking you through here, is understanding what it is exactly that Paul is saying.
But you're right that it isn't just that they didn't like your presentation. I think that I've heard people criticize Paul about that, himself. And Messianics also criticize Paul because he trivializes or minimizes the importance of the Jewish customs. Sometimes he'll say things like, Christ has become my Passover now, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
When he says stuff like that, it's like, hey, he's with us, and then bam, he just said, no, that's not it. We don't read that stuff. And they get mad with it. And I have actually heard people say that, when we were in heart of worship, they would say that they like Paul, but there's just some things he says that get me mad. I said, well, what are you talking about? It's the Bible,
He's an apostle.
And he's speaking God's word. I mean, even to the point of death. So he really meant what he said. And if you need, and I would say to them, if you want to go with somebody's opinion as opposed to what's in Scripture, you're already in a lot of trouble right there.
Yeah.
Something is terribly wrong.
Yeah, and to be honest, all the problems I've seen that people have with what Paul says is because they don't understand what Paul says. And Paul writes in these long, complicated sentences, and you'll see here he uses different techniques to bring his message out that can just confuse people and make it hard for them to understand. And this is
in Romans, you can see he's a bit of an intellectual.
Oh, absolutely.
And he might be going over some people's heads there.
Yeah, it definitely happens, and this is one of those places. And so the correct teaching that happens is what I call the temple prostitute lie. And the idea here is that there were some temple prostitutes who were bald, and that's just how they were identified as being bald. And so what Paul is really saying here is that he doesn't want Christian women to look like temple prostitutes. But that doesn't really make any sense. And so the argument there is because he was just talking about temple prostitutes and women not looking like temple prostitutes, then because we don't have temple prostitutes now, we can ignore all of what 1 Corinthians 11 says. But that's not correct, because Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 11 talks about a bunch of different things too. And so this would have been a big problem if that had really been the truth back in those times, because if a Christian woman was traveling, she'd have to find out what town she was in and what the prostitutes were wearing or what they were doing, and make sure that she didn't do the same thing. But we never see that idea presented in the Bible. There's no try not to look like this person or try not to dress like this person. And so it's false for a bunch of different reasons. Paul is talking about men and women, and both of them, and not just women. And bald for women is a problem, Paul says, but for men it's not a problem. It isn't a disgrace for a man to be bald. And so if you had a bald male prostitute, who cares? That's not a bad thing for a male. So their idea that it was bald temple prostitutes that were the problem doesn't make any sense when you think of it in the context of men. And like I said, Christians really aren't told to care about what the world dresses like or acts like. Well, yeah. So Paul talks about more than being bald here. And it isn't really about being bald. It's about covering your head. And that'll make more sense as we dig into it. And also, finally, Paul does say what his reasonings are behind this teaching. It isn't like he said, don't do this and never explained it. He does explain it. He gives a whole bunch of biblical-based reasons for it. And so he doesn't need somebody coming up with another explanation for what he's talking about. He's given his own. So Chance's question really came down to, did Jesus have long hair or did he cover his head? And because that's what Paul is talking about here. And so that really boils down to a smaller question, which is, was Paul teaching something different from what the Jews and Jesus were doing at that time or had been doing just like a decade or two before? And so that would be kind of confusing if Paul was teaching something different than the people had been doing. And so if the people had had long hair and were covering their heads, the men, then that would have been different. And Paul should have been explaining why he was teaching something different. But Paul doesn't do that. And so the first part of that is, did Jews of that time normally have long hair? Was that how they dressed at that time? And here's a picture of a statue of Julius Caesar, I believe this was. But when you look at, now he's not a Jew, he's a Roman, but Romans weren't that far away. And culturally, they weren't that far away either. And what you see with the Romans, all of the statues they have of all their Caesars and everybody else, they're all short-haired men. And so people at that time were keeping their hair short. That's the Romans for sure. But because of God's commandment not to create statues or not to make pictures of people, there are no pictures or statues of anyone from Israel. So we don't have a really good definition of saying that the Jews weren't doing this. We do see in the Bible certain special cases of long hair. And Samson is one of those. We know that Samson is a special case because he was under a lifetime Nazirite vow. And so he didn't cut his hair. And his strength came from not cutting his hair. But that was a special case. That's a Nazirite vow. And Absalom, we see that he cut his hair once a year. And when he did, it was an amazing thing because he had such thick hair. And in fact, he was vainglorious. I like that word. He was puffed up about his hair and arrogant about it and gave himself a lot of credit for that. And ultimately, he died by his hair. So that isn't an example of people normal. This whole story about him, especially dying by his hair, is really a story about his vanity about his hair and his hair being exceptionally long by anybody's standard. And so there's no reason to believe that Absalom is any kind of example of what people normally did. The Bible hardly ever talks about hair length, and most of the time when it does, it talks about people who are bald, and usually that's because of a medical condition or a disease or something like that. And Elisha was one of the few examples of that. It mentions that Elisha was bald, and that was considered odd. There were some boys who were taunting him and calling him baldy because of that. And so we know that being bald was unusual, but that's just one of those few references to hair length that we see.
I don't see how Elisha could control that. That was like natural.
Yeah. For him, it probably was natural. We have no reason to believe that he would have intentionally kept his hair short like that. And so the boys were making fun of him for that. And so we might ask also that what do Jews do with their hair now? Do they keep it long or short? Well, no, they keep it short. And I have a picture here you can see. It's kind of common in some of the groups to have this little tassel coming down from their sideburns. But not all of them do that. But they all have short hair. If you find any pictures of any of the Jews out there, you'll find that they have short hair, and that's how they keep it now. But you can't really say much from that because that might have changed since Jesus' time. That's been 2,000 years. And if the Bible didn't say do it one way or the other, then they might have chosen a different thing now than they did before. And so now we'll talk a little bit about head coverings. Do Jewish men wear head coverings now? Yes, they do. They certainly do that now. And we know that priests wore turbans back in Jesus' time. That was part of their official clothing that they had to wear. But when you look at any Old Testament references about covering one's head, it's always a sign of mourning or something bad like that. It's never a sign of something you should be doing for that. And so there's a couple of verses here that talk about that. And just summarizing them, I'm not going to read the verse here. This is when David is being chased out by his son out of Jerusalem. And as he goes up the Mount of Olives, he begins crying and weeping, and he covers his head, it says. And he walked barefoot. So he went up the Mount of Olives weeping and covering his head. And so he's mourning because of what's happened to him because of his son. And so that is a case where he covered his head, but it was because of mourning, and it was only for that reason. And so we know that they didn't normally cover their heads, but in this case it's mentioned because he covered his head for that special occasion. And then there's another reference in Jeremiah about some boys. This is a prophetic reference about boys who were ashamed that they were unable to get water from a well because the land had turned against the people. And so they covered their heads. So again, it's a sign of mourning or shame that they were covering their heads. And so there's just a couple references in the Bible about that. So from that, it doesn't look like there's any reason to believe that people had head coverings back then like the Jews wear now. Because especially with David, it mentions that he covered his head for that as he walked out in mourning. And if he had already had his head covered, then he wouldn't have needed to do that. So it seems like his normal wear was not to have a head covering. And so there's no Bible commandment that talks about wearing a hat or a need to. And so where did the Jews get that idea from that they're now all of them wear hats? And so I did some research into that, and it seems like the earliest reference to an idea that a Jew should be wearing a hat comes from 1100 AD, so not even 1,000 years ago. It appears in the Talmud in rabbinic writings, and the Talmud is a document that people have been adding to over time, rabbinic writings about different things, where a rabbi writes what his opinion is on that. And in this one in particular, he just says that this should be an option for men to cover their hair or to cover their heads with some kind of a hat. And it's his own idea. He says, well, if you look at the Bible, you can see that. Well, you can't see that in the Bible. Nobody else knows why this guy has said this. But because he said this, it got started, and people started wearing hats. The Jews started wearing hats. And from what he said, even it's not even clear who should wear them or when they should be worn. And so right now, Jewish men wear them pretty much all the time, in church or out of church. It doesn't seem to matter.
And of course, they have that little cap. I forgot what they call it.
There's a whole bunch of different ones. Yeah, you see the guy here with a hat. Others just have a little cloth beanie cap, and others have different things. And so what you wear also is completely optional. And so what happened with this one guy's apparently a suggestion, although he felt that he had a biblical basis for it, but there doesn't seem to be any, has now become a tradition and a law, and these people are required to wear it. In fact, it's gotten so bad now in our time that the women have started wearing it and requiring the children to wear it as well. And so it's kind of gotten out of control. So there's no basis in the Bible for that idea. It seems to have come from a rabbi and relatively recently. So what we can kind of understand from what we've seen so far is that Jesus had shortish hair. We don't know how short or anything like that. And when you look at some scholars, I did some research on that about different people who study all of this history stuff. And they agree with that. They say that men wore their hair short back then because it really just made sense. When you're working hard out in the field, it's a lot easier to manage short hair than long hair. When you're in a military or you could be called into a military, remember a lot of that time, anybody who was in the country could be called into the military to serve right away. They didn't have standing militaries like we did. or mostly they didn't, and they would just call out all the people to come and defend their country. And so at any time you can be called out for military service, and especially in military service, it makes a lot of sense to have your hair short and not flopping around in your face, anything like that. So for a lot of reasons like that, men wore their hair relatively short, as we saw in that Caesar statue. And so this comes down to really maybe Chance's main question here is, why is Jesus depicted with long hair? In all of the pictures that we see of Jesus, why is he always shown in long hair? And if you go back in history, that goes back a long ways. The longest people, back to the early Greek days, Jesus, the depictions of him show him in long hair. And so, again, I did research on that one, and I found that there are two main streams of thought, and I have one of my own to kind of add to that. And so, one thought is that the Greco-Roman gods had long hair in a lot of the pictures. So Zeus would have been drawn with long hair. And so that long hair was kind of considered a sign of divinity. Only the gods were able to have long hair. And so it may have been that reason that they thought that because Jesus was God, then he would have also had long hair. So he's depicted in the earliest pictures by Greek and Romans as having long hair, because to them that was a sign of divinity. Well, maybe, could be, don't know. And the other thought is that Jesus was a Nazarite, but there's no evidence that he was a Nazarite. He was from Nazareth, but that's different from being a Nazarite. Nazareth is a place in Israel. I've been there, and a Nazarite is a vow. So there doesn't seem to be any real evidence that Jesus was a Nazarite. And my own idea is, at least from our time, there's a stereotype, a sense that anyone who's a primitive person is hairy, brutish, and dumb. And so we kind of associate Cro-Magnon people. We automatically assume that they were long-haired people, slumping along, muscular, but not very bright. And so that kind of stereotype may have been in effect back then as well. So, but could men keep their hair short? Was that really a possibility at that time? And yes, men have been shearing sheep from the time when there were sheep, from about the first sheep he would have needed to have been sheared. And so men have been cutting hair, who knows with what tool, from a long time ago. And when you see that Caesar statue, his hair isn't just cut. It's kind of nicely curled and looking fine. So they had some skill in that area, but it's odd that people would have been having all these haircuts, and the Bible never ever mentions anybody getting a haircut, but it doesn't talk about a lot of other personal things like that either. So and so when you think about it, Adam more than likely had to have some kind of a knife when he was in the garden pruning the garden, because you need to trim off branches and stuff like that, and you need to have a knife. So probably God showed him how to make a knife from a stone or whatever, and that's what he did. So it seems entirely reasonable that we've been shearing sheep for as long as anyone can ever remember, and cutting hair because of that. And so it wouldn't have been a big deal to cut human hair as well. Okay, so we're going to head into the verses here. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of this today. I've got a lot of slides on this. But anyway, the context here is Paul is talking about while praying and prophesying. And we'll see that in the verses when we get to them. That's really the situation, he says, is this is where hair length really matter. But it also kind of matters in a larger context, because you could be praying any time of the day, not just in a church. And so you would probably wear your hair in a particular way because you might be praying or prophesying at any time. In any case, and also we need to understand the cultural context at that time. We don't have a lot of problems with hair now like they used to. They were much more common back then, and they had less treatments for the problems that they did have. And one of the big ones that they did have was lice. If you got lice in your hair, and Melody remembers this. I don't remember anybody having lice, but she says when she was a kid, lice would sometimes get into somebody's head at the school, and it would get passed around the whole school, and all the kids would have lice, and they'd all have to have their hair shaved off, because you just couldn't get rid of lice any other way than to cut their hair right off, and that's what they would do.
Well, the stores used to sell these little combs. They were really fine too,
Mm-hmm.
and whenever there was like a breakout like that, and everybody was buying them like crazy.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah, they did that in my time when I was a kid too.
yes, I imagine. And but nowadays there are treatments that make that not much of a problem, and I haven't heard of anybody with lice in all that time. And so there are lots of other reasons that you could also be losing hair, and things that we can treat now. Pregnancy sometimes causes hair loss, thyroid disorders, anemia, autoimmune diseases, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. Different skin conditions can cause it. A lot of these things are all treatable now, or at least to some degree. And in our time, one of the things that we see, in fact, this is probably the only reason I've seen anybody any woman who has lost her hair, is because of a cancer treatment. And very often the drugs or the treatments that they're giving you will cause you to lose your hair. And so that's just one of the few times when you see hair loss like that. So keep that in mind. Things were different back then. So what is Paul going to be addressing in these verses? He's going to be talking really about head coverings, and his point is that a cover is sometimes needed, and sometimes not wanted at all. And so it's not just generally a covering; or is generally a covering, and not specifically just hair. But hair becomes a covering, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And he talks both men and women, and each one has a different case and a different reason for what he says should be the standard for them. And this is really a spiritual argument. It's not a dress code or a statement on fashion or a statement about how long hair should be. He really embeds it in spiritual matters, in biblical matters, and says that here's the foundation for it, and it's because it would be an offense to God to do this. And so it's not a general idea that he says, well, I think this is my opinion, blah, blah, blah. No, he goes to the Bible and says, here, this is the way things are. And so what he doesn't do for men, and this was kind of Chance's complaint, is he doesn't really give an example of how much hair is too much hair. And so is this too much? Well, to me, that seems fairly shortish. I don't know. How long is too long? And he doesn't give men any guidance there at all for what's too long. But for women, he does give examples of that, of what is too little. And we'll look at that when we hit the verses. But in that case, too little is really too little, and not even close to what a normal woman would wear for hair. And so, and I'll bring back this point a couple times too. Even well-meaning people misunderstand what Paul says here, and there's a lot of reasons for it. He does some complicated things in the text that can cause you to misunderstand it, and he leaves a whole bunch of things out. He doesn't explain things like I talked about. He doesn't say for men how long is too long, and he kind of expects the reader to figure that out for themselves. And so there's quite a bit of that kind of thing. It's complicated text, and it's tough for people to figure it out. So it's easy for people to misunderstand what he's saying here. And one of the biggest problems is his main point comes at the end of the text. And if he'd started the text with that point, then you would be able to see what it is. But what happens is, if you read it in the way that he's written it, you get more and more confused. And once you get down to what the real point is, it seems like the real point is in conflict with everything that he said, because you've misunderstood that. And so it's better to start with this one verse first, and that's the way I'm going to do that. And so he says, and this is the case for women. For men, there is a verse like this, but he says, and whenever a woman grows her hair, it is a glory to her, because her hair is given to her in place of a covering. Okay, so he says for a woman, when her hair is grown out, that is the covering that she needs, and she doesn't need any other covering. So when we saw that picture there of the women having those little head things over their hair, that's not what he's talking about. He says if your hair is grown out, then that's the covering you need, and you don't need any other covering. And so if you start with that understanding of things, then you're good. And so he's going to be talking about exceptions to that, when a woman's hair is not grown out. And we'll see that as we go through here. And so, and the other thing we need to understand is there's a very big cultural difference in what he means by head. And in fact, he uses the word head in two different ways, which complicates things. And so when he says head, he means a head without hair. So when he says a woman needs to cover her head, he doesn't mean a covering over this. He means covering over the skin, over the scalp. But we don't talk about things that way. We treat head hair as though it was the only kind of hair we had. And so if your mom said to you, go and comb your hair, you wouldn't be combing your arm hair, you wouldn't be combing your leg hair, your chest hair. She understands, and you should understand too, that she's talking about your head hair. And so by default, when we talk about hair, we talk about head hair. But he doesn't do that. You're going to see that he talks about the head of your, or the hair of your head. And that's a common reference when you get into really literal translations. You can see that. And so I actually showed a couple of verses here. This one is from Matthew 10:30, and he says, but the hairs of your head are all numbered. So he doesn't just say your hairs are all numbered. He says the hairs of your head are all numbered. And from Luke 7:38, she was weeping, and she began washing his feet with her tears and wiping them with the hair of her head. She didn't use her arm hair. She didn't use her leg hair. She was using the hair of her head. And so they disambiguate culturally always what kind of hair they're talking about. So they always make it clear what kind of hair they're talking about. And not like us, where we assume that if we just mention hair, then we're talking about head hair. And so there's one more here. But there are lots of other examples in the Bible. I just picked out these three. And this is from Luke 21:18. And it says, a hair of your head shall not be lost. And so he's just talking specifically about head hair. And that's a way that we don't do things. Okay, and then the other thing that makes this complicated is that he's going to use the word head in another sense. He's going to use it in terms of meaning authority. And well, that's actually the first verse that we're going to start with here. And so he talks about your head, meaning the person who is in authority over you. And we do that in business quite a lot. There are group heads and different management heads. And that's the common term that we use to mean the person who's in charge of this group of people. And so it's not an unusual thing for us. But what Paul is going to do is he's going to mix both meanings of head into a single verse. And that makes it complicated. Okay, so head as authority. And this is where we start from. And this is 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I want you to know that the head of every man is the Messiah, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of the Messiah is God. So he sets up a headship. He says God is at the top, then the Messiah, then the man, then the woman. And these are all in charge of the person below them. And so he's using head here in the sense of authority. This person is in authority over you. And the problem is here that he's going to carry that into the next verse, but not explain that he's using it that way. And so the verse is almost never correctly understood. And he says, every man who prays or prophesies while covering his head disgraces his head. So as I said, he's using head in both of these ways. The first head, he says, while covering his head, he means scalp, as we talked about before. But his second use, disgraces of head, is referring to the person in authority over you. So he's really saying here, if you kind of change the verse to make it more obvious what he's saying every man who prays or prophesies while covering his scalp disgraces the one in authority over him, which for men is the Messiah. And probably he also refers to disgracing yourself because of that. That one's not clear. And so right away he's done something odd with the way he's using the word head. He has two meanings of it in the same sentence. And so it's difficult to understand what he's saying. But his point there really is that you are not disgracing just your head. You are disgracing the person who is in authority over you. And that we'll come back to that too. That shows up with women as well. Okay, so for women, now that was the verse for men, and the verse for women is pretty much identical. He says, and every woman praying or prophesying while revealing her head disgraces her head, which is the man, and herself as well, and she is equal with her whose head is shaven. Okay, now we're getting into the complicated things. He says that women are not to reveal their head, but what is meant by revealing her head? And he's not clear on that one, and we'll be able to make a logical guess at what he means by that, by what he says in the next couple of verses, and we'll figure that out, I think, pretty easily. And so he does say here that revealing her head, whatever that is, makes a woman equal to a woman whose head is shaved. Okay, so keep that locked into your mind, because it's going to apply right away here. And then he says, for if a woman is not covered, she should also be sheared. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to be sheared or shaven, let her be covered. And right away, you can see that this is becoming a complicated thing that he's talking about. So he's identified three different groups of women here. those women who are not covered or whose heads are revealed, as he said in the last verse, and we don't know what that is. And then he talks about women whose heads are sheared, and that's the same word you would use for sheep. And so when you shear a sheep, we call it a brush cut. I don't know if you called it that when you were growing up, but it's when your hair are just kind of like little tiny bristles. So you're cut down to bristles, but there's still hair there. And so that's what shearing is for a sheep. And so that's what shearing would be for a person as well, is just very short bristly hair, and that's all. And he also talks about the third group, which is women whose heads are shaven, which is no hair remaining. It's just been completely shaved off, and there's no hair. Yes, him for a different reason. For him, it's natural. And so now remember, men, it's different than women here. This is the group for women that we're talking about here. So we have these three different groups: women whose heads are not covered. We don't really understand what that means, but we're going to figure it out. And women whose heads are sheared like sheep, and women whose heads are shaven and no hair remains. And he talks about this first group being different from, but equal to, the group of women who are shaven. So these women whose heads are not covered, it's just as though they are shaven, he says. And he says that they should be sheared if they're in that condition. But we don't understand that condition yet. He hasn't explained it. And he doesn't explain it. We have to kind of figure it out. Okay, so what does it mean to reveal her head or to not be covered? What he says is it's not the same as sheared or shaven, but it's somehow equivalent to that. And so we can see that this person has some hair, because he says this person should be shaven, but they're somehow equivalent to a person who's sheared or shaven. And so it seems like the only answer you can come up with is that it's either patchy hair that he's talking about, or someone who's balding, a woman who's balding and is losing part of the hair, because you kind of wiped out all the other possibilities. If it isn't sheared like a sheep or it isn't shaven right down, then what's your other possibility for that third uncovered head? And it seems like it's talking about patchy hair or balding. And this kind of takes us back to the lice situation, or else maybe other things are causing women to lose their hair or become patchy with their hair. And that's what he's talking about. And so it kind of makes sense to me that that's really what he's talking about, is that for some hair loss reason, the woman in question has patchy hair or is balding in spots. And so he doesn't say that. That's just using some reasoning based on what he's saying. And so if she's not shaven completely, or if she isn't sheared down to real short, then what is she that she's in this condition of having a revealed head? Patchy or balding makes sense to me. I can't think of anything else. Okay, now continuing on with the verses. And now he talks about men here. For a man ought not to cover his head, because he is the image and the glory of God. But a woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman is from man. For neither was man created for the sake of women, but woman for the sake of man. And so that's another complicated thing to understand what he's saying there. And so really he's going back to that line of authority argument that he started with on the very first verse here. He says that because of this line of authority, then the things are different for a man and for a woman. He says the man was created in the image of God, so man is the glory of God. And then he says, therefore the man is not to cover his head when praying or prophesying. And I do not understand that, what his basis is for that. But he says that that's the way it is, and it is that way because of because we're in the image of God.
I think maybe the custom between some Jewish, they do cover the hair when they want to give a study and for the pray.
Well, now? Yeah, did you see the slide I had of the Jewish man with the hat on? Yeah.
I seen them with they cover the.
Yeah, they do, but that's not biblical. There's nothing in the Bible that talks about that. Tracing it back as far as you can, it looks like it came from a rabbi about 1,000 years ago. And so it's a made-up idea. There's no basis in the Bible for it. And that's part of what was confusing Chance, I think, is that there are people, Jews and pictures of Jesus, that seem to be out of line with what Paul is talking about here. And so, and as I said, Jewish women are now wearing those hats, which seems odd, but they do.
I know when I started going to church, when Martha and I were in our teens, they had, most of the women in the Church of God were covering their hair.
Yeah.
So that was very much of a custom.
It's with a veil.
But some wore hats as well.
Yeah.
But it just seems like very gradually they stopped doing that on their own. And initially, some people didn't like women not to keep doing that for whatever reason, but nobody could come up with a real good reason.
Right.
You know.
I think that we use this verse.
Yeah, because Paul, when you understand what Paul is saying, he's saying that women don't have a need to cover their hair. They already have hair as a covering, and so it makes no sense to put anything else on.
But then what does long mean also?
Well, for women, long isn't a problem. It's only a problem for men, and so for men and women, it's quite different. And yes, the question still remains for men: how long is too long? But for women, there is no too long. For women, there's only too short. That's a problem, and that's what he's been talking about here with those women with their hair in those 3 different states: sheared, shaven, or the kind of unknown state that is probably patchy or balding. Okay, so for reasons I don't understand, he says that because men are created in the image of God, therefore we do not cover our head when praying or prophesying. And I don't know the basis for that at all, and he doesn't explain that. But he does say that the woman was created from the rib of man, is the point he's making here, to be a helper to man for the sake of man. So woman is the glory of man, he says. And ultimately from that, it comes with the other idea that a woman needs to cover her head. And I don't understand that one either. I don't know the basis for that one. And so I said, one of the problems here in what Paul says, he's probably explained this in all of the churches that he brought up, the foundation for this, and he just assumes that all the readers already know it. But we in our time certainly don't know it, and it just confuses us.
Well, I know that the Corinthian church appeared to have that custom. And towards the end of that discussion, he tells them, but we in the Church of God don't have that custom.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get to that.
Yeah, okay.
And so, continue on in the verses here. Because of this, a woman is obligated to have authority over her head for the sake of angels. Now, that's an interesting thing. He says not just for no reason at all. He says women are obligated to have authority over the length of their hair and to manage their hair for the sake of angels. And so going back to the verse that we started it with at the first, he says a woman's hair is part of that glory that she has. And therefore, Paul says a woman is to exercise proper control over her head. It's for her to do that, what's right with her head. And so in doing so, she covers her head, and he says that this is for the sake of angels. And the implication there is that angels look down on us and see us, and it would be a shock to an angel to see a woman with an uncovered head. Again, I don't know a basis for that. But because he's an apostle, we accept that.
He seems to say some things that there's no real basis for it, but it seems like he has some inside knowledge,
Yeah.
So I don't know. Nobody else did things like that,
Yeah, he was talking a lot about the churches and managing churches and gives instructions on that. So he kind of deals with this topic more than other people who wrote did. And so, because he's an apostle, we just accept that he has that basis for it, but we don't know what it is. And so we might wonder about why it is that angels would be offended if a woman's head was uncovered. And is it because she's somehow stealing the glory of a man by uncovering her head? I don't know. It's kind of a guess. Does this maybe relate to men dressing as women and women dressing as men? I don't know that. I know there's certainly a prohibition against that.
That's a topic for another big discussion, because what is a clothing of men and what is clothing of women?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you would say, well, men can't wear dresses or can't wear clothing that looks like women, but at that time they were having some sort of gown thing, They didn't have trousers like we do today.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's complicated.
Yeah, in that one though, I think the answer is more easily addressed at the spiritual level. You shouldn't have in you the desire to dress like a woman if you're a man, and so it's really talking more about a spiritual condition than the dress, because as you said, dress codes have changed. There have been times when men wore what looked like mini skirts or skirts, and that seems strange to us in this country, but there are still people who do it in other countries. So yeah, it's so in that case, it's really not so much about dress code, but what's inside of you, what's in your heart. Are you desiring to dress like a woman, and you're actually a man? That sort of thing.
So if they wore kilts, were they dressing like women or what? No, we're not. Very confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we're not going to go there today. You can have that topic. Okay, so the next verse is, and so now in this one, what he's been talking about entirely so far is this natural order of things where God is head over the Messiah is head over man, and man is head over the woman. And so now he kind of goes against that. Well, let me read the verse and we'll talk about it. However, a man is not without a woman, neither a woman without a man in our Lord. Just as woman is from man, in this way also a man is by a woman, but everything is from God. And so again, it's another complicated sentence that he's working with here. But what he's saying is that in our Lord Jesus, men and women are not independent or separate. They're not somehow different things. God's people are one community altogether. And so he says women are born from men just as men are born from women. And so he says that every woman had a father and every man had a mother. And so in our time, we all are one community of people. And so he's really just using nature as his model of how we should live here. He says this natural order is set up by God, but that doesn't mean the woman is any less than the man, or the man is somehow better than the woman. That's not what this is about. This is simply the order of things that God has set in place. And he emphasizes that oneness of women and men in God. He says these people are one together. Nonetheless, there is this natural order that God has put in place. Okay, so now he does an argument from nature. He's been doing that Bible-based argument about this is the order that God set in place, and you can see that, and that's why the head coverings are different for men and women. But now he goes to an argument from nature, and he says, "Judge among yourselves. Is it right for a woman to pray to God while revealing her head? Does not even nature teach you that even that when a man has grown his hair, it is a disgrace to him, and whenever a woman grows her hair, it is a glory to her, because her hair is given to her in place of a covering." Now, that's the verse that we started with. And so this idea is really that if you just look at it and assumably you haven't been exposed to it constantly, and it feels wrong. It just seems wrong to you when you see a woman with no hair. And he says, in your own nature, you can tell that because your nature tells you that.
In my version, New King James, verse 15, it says, "But if a woman had long hair," and I thought, well, how do you define long?
Yeah, well, and here in this more direct translation, it says when a woman grows her hair. Grows her hair how long? Don't know. And so, but what he does talk about, we know, is he talks about those three different cases that are a problem. He says shaved, sheared, and the other one, which is probably patchy. And those three are the real problem for her. And so what he says here again is that first verse that we started with is because her hair is given to her in place of a covering. So as long as she's grown her hair out, however long that is, then it is the covering that she needs, and she doesn't need any covering on top of that.
From the other could imply that could be any so could imply that if you have short hair you cannot braid.
Well, yeah, but when we say short hair, we're thinking of just a little bob or something like that. But that's not what he's talking about here. When he says short hair, the examples that he uses are a woman who has a brush cut, or a woman who is completely shaved off, or a woman who has patchy hair. So he doesn't talk about the case of a woman who's just got a really short bob length. Yeah, and so as in the case of men, he doesn't talk about how long it has to be in order for it to be grown enough to be a covering. And for men, how long it is that it's too much, and it is too much of a covering. And so I think the real takeaway from this is that if you're in that rare situation, especially rare in our time, of being sheared or shaved or patchy hair, then you need to cover up. And so it's really only those cases that we know for sure that he talks about as being a problem that needs to be dealt with.
I think if I'm reading between the lines, that there's no way to differentiate between a woman with shaved hair and a woman with hair if they're both covered. You know what I mean? So, like those temple prostitutes, I have a feeling that they must have covered their head because they didn't have any hair. So if the women that have hair and they're still covering their head, it's like, how do we know the difference? You shouldn't have that on your head because that's what you have your hair for. But he doesn't tell the other women that have their shaved head not to uncover themselves, not to take their cover.
Yeah. All he really says there is he addresses those three cases, and he says that those cases you need to have a cover, and your hair isn't long enough to be a cover. And then he really doesn't talk about how long it needs to be in order to be the cover. And so in those three cases again, the hair isn't enough to be a cover. And so there needs to be another covering, and that covering can be whatever you want, a scarf or whatever you want, until either your hair grows back or whatever. And then you would have your natural covering. Does that make sense that way?
I think I've seen some of the Messianic people, most of the women, they cover their hair because I guess based on one of the verses that said the man is the authority, and so that's what they get that, and like for them, not covering their hair means like, okay, you're available. It's almost like wearing a ring, you need to, you're married, you need to wear a ring.
Yeah. But there really isn't any biblical basis from that. That's coming from Jewish tradition. And that's one of the dangers in the Messianic community is they often look towards the Jews as being their example. And in fact, the Jews of today are more like the Roman Catholic Church than the real Jews of Jesus' time. They have got all sorts of traditions and beliefs that have come in and things that aren't biblical. And a lot of that they do is not based on the Bible at all. It's just stuff they've made up. And we even see that in Jesus' time. He talks about some of these traditions that have gotten in that are reverses of what God had said and contradict what God has said. But because they've become such a tradition, they can't get rid of them. The people hold on to those things as though they were God's word, but they're not.
I know if Cynthia were here, she would mention that she came from a Catholic background, and she wasn't just like an occasional goer. She went all the time. And when she was invited to the Masonic Church, she decided to go just out of curiosity, see what it was about. She said, I could not tell any difference between the Catholic Church and it was almost the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I felt like this is what I got away from. Why am I trying to get back into this? You know?
Yeah.
And because she had started going to our church. But she went and visited with them, and she just felt very odd,
Yeah, and that's true. But we can't judge all the Messianic churches that way.
No, they have different.
Yeah, with Protestants, there's kind of a standard, and you can say Protestants all do pretty much these things. But the Messianic Jews vary. Some are really Jews, or the Messianics are like Jews. But in other cases, they're more like just us. They're like that. And so we could really be called light Messianics.
I have a sister that goes to a Messianic type of church, and I met some of those folks, and you can't tell that they're Messianic. Occasionally, they do refer to their pastor as their rabbi, and occasionally he puts on this little hat, but most of the time he doesn't. So when they're over there having their service, I've seen like videos of them. I can't tell the difference between them and a regular church.
Yeah.
But you're right, I mean, they're not all the same, you know.
Definitely not, yeah. Okay, so here's the verse the pastor was talking about, and I think that this is about the last verse here. And it says, but if a man disputes against these things that he's been saying, we have no such custom, neither does the church of God. So he says we don't. So he's probably talking about the apostles when he says we, because he also talks about the church of God. He says we, the apostles, have no such custom, neither does the church of God. And so he's really saying there that if you don't like what I've just said, you have no foundation for anything that you think. There's nothing in the church of God that has any other practice, any other teaching.
And he had some of the ladies with him, as you recall, that were, you know, ministering with him. And I have a feeling that they might have wanted them to cover their heads too. So when he said we, he wasn't just talking about him and the other man, but he was talking about some of the women that were working with him.
Yeah, that likely true. Yeah. Okay, so reviewing now, and then we'll close out. So the foundation for Paul's reasoning. Paul provides his own foundation. He doesn't need someone telling us that this is all about temple prostitutes. And so the foundation is creation. That's one of the big things, is God created man first and then the woman from man. Therefore, man is the glory of God and woman is the glory of man. And he repeats that a couple times as he's talking about that. So that natural order that he's talked about in other places is the foundation for this teaching. And he also talks about disgracing the head. And what he has said here is it's a disgrace for God to see a man with his head covered. And it's a disgrace for man to see a woman with her head uncovered. And he also talked about it offends angels to see a woman with her head uncovered. And so his basis is in all of these things, that it is an offense to God or to the man or to an angel to have things out of order. And the third thing that he uses for reasoning is nature. And we just kind of finished that argument there. He says, which basically means you can see by observation and what feels right inside of you. Is it not a disgrace for a man to have grown his hair out too much? Is it a glory for a woman to have grown her hair? Yes, it is. And so those things are the basis for what he's been teaching here. So summarizing all of this, and too much is made out of this teaching because it doesn't apply to hardly anybody in the church. But for women, if your scalp is showing, and he talked about those cases I mentioned over and over again, sheared, shaved, or the third one, which is probably patchy or balding for whatever reason, then you need to cover up. Some kind of a cover, put it over top. If you're a man with too much hair covering his head, you need to trim it up. And so that's all. The whole summary of all of this comes down to those things. So, and in our time, women almost never are in that situation. And very few men in the church have their hair too long. And as Chance was saying, how long is too long becomes a bit of a question there. And for men and for women, how long is long enough that it is covering? And Paul just gives us no guidance on that. He expects us to use our common sense, I guess. So any questions?
The only question I have is, how does a woman know if angels are watching them or not?
I think you assume that.
You better cover up. That's kind of confusing too.
Well, I think you're to assume that angels could watch anytime.
Well, in that case, you got to wear it all the time, so that undermines the whole discussion there. So I don't know.
Do we think about the bargaining?
Well, yeah. Yeah, he doesn't say guardian angel, but maybe that's what he's talking about.
Because,
but yeah, this is really a very simple teaching that gets too complicated because he's giving the foundation for it. But it's really just for a woman, if the head is exposed, the scalp is exposed, then that's not the way it should be. And for men, if your hair is too long, that isn't right too, but he gives us no guidance on that.